The bank told him to sell his John Deere, and Ethan Caldwell didn't argue, didn't negotiate, didn't even ask for more time. And 27 days later, he walked back into that same office and paid off every dollar of his debt with money that had been sitting under his land since before he took his first steps. Money the bank had never asked about because they didn't know it was there. And on that Monday morning in late June of 2019, Ethan was sitting across from Mark Halverson in the Prairie State Bank branch in Hutchinson, Kansas, in the same chair that generations of farmers had sat in when numbers stopped being numbers and started becoming decisions. And Mark had the loan file open between them with the neat, structured order of a man who had done this often enough to reduce hardship to a sequence of bullet points and conclusions. And the numbers were clean and accurate in the way numbers usually are when they are separated from the story behind them. 2 seasons of erratic weather, 1 flood in the spring that delayed planting, 1 drought in late summer that cut yields in half, and a market price that had dropped just enough to turn a manageable year into a losing one. And then another year that followed the same pattern just differently enough to prevent recovery. And the result was a $180,000 operating loan that had slipped into delinquency with arrears pushing past the threshold that the bank's policy defined as unacceptable risk, and Mark explained it the way he explained all of his cases, methodically, without urgency, because urgency in his line of work was reserved for the borrower, not the lender. And when he finished, he closed the folder halfway and said, "Ethan, the bank needs a concrete plan to bring this loan back into performing status within 30 days. And Ethan had asked, "What does a concrete plan look like to you?" And Mark had said, "Given your current asset structure, the most direct option is liquidation of the 2016 John Deere 8245R. And he said it without emphasis, the way a man says something he considers obvious. And Ethan knew exactly which tractor he meant, because there was only one machine on his farm that matched that description and that value, a machine worth just over $200,000 in current market conditions, a machine that could erase the debt completely and leave him with enough working capital to start again. And Ethan had looked at Mark Halverson for a long moment and said nothing, not because he didn't understand what was being asked of him, but because he understood it too well to respond quickly. And Mark interpreted the silence the way loan officers are trained to interpret silence, as resistance softening into acceptance, and said, "I understand it's not ideal." And Ethan had nodded once and said, "I'll be in touch," and stood up and shook his hand and walked out into the Kansas heat that pressed down on the parking lot like something physical and unignorable. And he drove back to his farm without turning on the radio, without calling anyone, without doing any of the things people do when they want to fill the space between a problem and its solution. And when he got home, the John Deere was sitting exactly where it always sat in the equipment shed, clean, maintained, ready, a machine that had done everything he had ever asked it to do and more. And Ethan stood in the doorway and looked at it the way he sometimes did when he needed to think, not inspecting it, not evaluating it, but letting its familiar presence hold the edges of his thoughts in place while he worked through what the situation actually required. Not what it appeared to require, not what the bank wanted it to require, but what the full accounting of his position would reveal if he took the time to look at it properly. And what he realized standing there was that the bank's accounting was complete in one sense and incomplete in another. Complete in the way that it captured everything visible, everything documented in standard forms, everything that fit within the framework of equipment, value and crop yield and land surface price, and incomplete in the way that it excluded anything that did not appear on those forms, anything that required a different kind of question to uncover. And Ethan knew there was something like that in his past, not clearly, not as a defined asset, but as a memory of a conversation he had once had with his grandfather in the late 1990s, standing on the edge of a dry patch of land on the western side of the property, a stretch of 60 acres that nobody farmed because it never produced enough to justify the cost. And his grandfather had said something then that hadn't made sense at the time and had not needed to make sense because there had been no reason for it to. Something about land not ending at the surface, something about value that sits underneath and waits. And Ethan had not thought about that conversation in years, not because it wasn't important, but because importance is often invisible until a situation demands it. And he left the shed and went into the house and into the small office where his grandfather had kept records for decades, a room that still held the same filing cabinet against the wall, metal, slightly rusted at the edges, drawers labeled in handwriting that had grown less steady over time, and Ethan knelt down and opened the bottom drawer, the one that held documents that didn't belong to any current year, the ones that had been moved there because they were finished with and therefore easy to forget, and he began flipping through folders that carried dates from the early 2000s, the 1990s, then earlier, until he found one labeled simply 1992, West Parcel, and he pulled it out and sat at the desk and opened it, and inside were documents that took him a few minutes to understand because they did not fit into the categories he was used to working with: surveys, legal descriptions, annotations in his grandfather's handwriting, and a report from a geological firm that described subsurface characteristics in language that was technical enough to obscure its significance unless you read it carefully. And Ethan read it carefully, line by line, the way a man reads something when he senses that the meaning is there but not immediately obvious. And what emerged slowly was a picture of that 60-acre stretch that was different from the one he had always held in his mind. Not useless land, not dead ground, but a location identified decades ago as sitting above a deep aquifer and mineral rich brine formations that, at the time, had no commercial value and therefore no practical importance. And attached to that report was a legal document from a sale his grandfather had executed in 1992, transferring partial surface rights of that parcel to a neighboring operation while explicitly retaining all subsurface and mineral rights, a decision that had been noted, documented, and then filed away without any follow-up because there had been nothing to follow up on. And Ethan sat back in the chair and looked at the documents spread out in front of him and felt the specific shift that occurs when a problem changes shape. Not solved yet, not even close, but no longer confined to the dimensions it had occupied an hour earlier. And he closed the folder and placed it on the desk and sat there for a long time as the afternoon light moved across the room, thinking about what he had just read, about what it might mean now in a world where resources that once held no value could suddenly hold significant value, and about the difference between what the bank had asked him to account for and what he had just discovered he still possessed. And the question in front of him was no longer whether he would sell the tractor, but whether selling it was the correct interpretation of the situation at all. And that was a different question entirely, one that required information he did not yet have. And as the light faded and the room grew dim, Ethan Caldwell understood that the next step was not to call a buyer for his John Deere, but to find out whether the thing that had been sitting in a folder since 1992 was still what it had been then, or whether time had turned it into something else entirely, something the bank had never considered because no one had ever thought to ask about it. The call he made the next morning was not to a tractor dealer or an auction house, and that alone would have surprised anyone at Prairie State Bank if they had known, because from their perspective the decision had already been made and only the mechanics remained. But Ethan Caldwell had reached a point in his thinking where the mechanics no longer mattered until the full scope of the situation was understood. And at 8:12 a.m. on Tuesday, he dialed the number listed at the bottom of the geological report in the 1992 folder, a company that no longer existed but whose records, after a brief search, led him to a resource broker named Daniel Reeves operating out of Oklahoma City, a man who had spent 23 years working at the intersection of land ownership and resource development, and who answered his phone with the efficiency of someone accustomed to conversations that either went nowhere quickly or somewhere important just as fast. And Ethan introduced himself and described the parcel, the retained subsurface rights, and the documentation he had in front of him. And Daniel was quiet for a moment in the way professionals are quiet when they are organizing information against experience. And then he said, "Give me the legal description." And Ethan read it carefully, and there was a pause filled only by the faint sound of typing on the other end. And then Daniel said, "Mr. Caldwell, how familiar are you with lithium extraction?" And Ethan said, "Not at all." And Daniel said, "You might want to become familiar." And what followed was an explanation that reframed everything Ethan thought he knew about the value of his land, not in broad terms or speculation, but in precise, current realities. Lithium demand had increased dramatically over the past decade due to its role in battery production, energy storage, and electric vehicles. And companies had begun identifying domestic sources of lithium-rich brine deposits as strategically valuable, and the geological markers described in the 1992 report matched formations that were now being actively pursued in parts of Kansas and Oklahoma. and Ethan's parcel, based on the legal description, fell within a corridor that had seen increased interest over the past 18 months, and Ethan listened without interrupting, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that this was the part of the conversation where listening mattered more than speaking. And when Daniel finished, Ethan asked the only question that mattered at that point. "What does that mean in practical terms?" And Daniel said, "It means you have something companies are currently paying for." And Ethan said, "How much?" And Daniel paused again, not hesitating, but calibrating, and said, "I'd need to run a proper market check, reach out to a few contacts, and confirm interest levels before giving you a number. But if the data lines up the way I think it does, you're not looking at a small figure." And Ethan said, "I have 30 days." And Daniel said, "I can give you a real number in 10. And Ethan said, "Not a range." And Daniel said, "A real number." And Ethan said, "That's what I need." And they ended the call, and Ethan sat at his desk with the folder still open in the sense that the problem had shifted again, not resolved, but expanded into something that required patience rather than action. And the 10 days that followed were the kind of days that separate people who react from people who wait. And Ethan had always been a man who understood the value of waiting when waiting was the correct response, and he went back to his routine with the same consistency he had always maintained: mornings in the fields, afternoons managing what could still be managed, evenings reviewing numbers that had not yet changed but would eventually need to align with whatever outcome emerged. And he told no one about the call, not his neighbor, not the supplier in town, not even the bank, when Mark Halverson called on the 5th day to ask whether a decision had been made about the tractor. And Ethan said, "I'm reviewing my options." And Mark said, "I want to make sure we're aligned on the timeline." And Ethan said, "We are," and ended the call without elaboration. And the restraint was intentional because information, when shared too early, has a way of shaping expectations before it has substance to support them. And Ethan had no interest in shaping expectations, only in confirming reality. And on the 10th day, at 7:03 a.m., Daniel Reeves called back, and the timing alone told Ethan that the conversation mattered, because men in Daniel's line of work did not call at that hour with anything that could wait. And Ethan answered, and Daniel said, "Mr. Caldwell, I've spoken with 3 companies operating in your corridor, and I have 2 preliminary offers and strong interest from a 3rd. And Ethan said nothing, waiting for the numbers. And Daniel said, "The first offer is $520,000 for a 5-year lease on your subsurface rights, with extension options and a royalty structure on any extraction." And Ethan closed his eyes briefly, not in disbelief, but in recognition of the scale of what he was hearing. And Daniel continued, "The second offer is slightly lower at $480,000, but with a higher royalty percentage." And Ethan said, "And a sale?" And Daniel said, "If you wanted to sell outright, you'd likely be looking at somewhere between $700,000 and $800,000, depending on negotiations." And Ethan let the numbers settle, not rushing to respond because the response was already clear, and said, "The lease is enough." And Daniel said, "That's what I would recommend if you're not looking to exit entirely." And Ethan said, "I'm not." And Daniel said, "Then we move forward with the $520,000 offer, subject to title verification and environmental review, which should take about 10 to 14 days. And Ethan said, "That puts me inside my deadline." And Daniel said, "Comfortably." And Ethan said, "Proceed." And when the call ended, Ethan remained at the table for several minutes, the phone still in his hand, the quiet of the house around him unchanged, but the reality of his situation entirely different from what it had been 10 days earlier. And the tractor in the shed was still the same tractor, the loan at the bank was still the same loan, but the equation connecting them had been replaced by something the bank had never considered because it existed outside the framework they had applied. And Ethan stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the western edge of his property where the 60 acres sat exactly as they always had, dry, unremarkable, and unchanged on the surface, and understood with complete clarity that the most valuable thing he owned had never been visible, and that the next step was not to prepare for a sale, but to prepare for a conversation that would take place in the same office, across the same desk, with the same man who had told him to sell his tractor, and that conversation would not be about what he was losing, but about what he had found. And the difference between those 2 positions was the difference between reacting to a problem and understanding it fully enough to change its outcome. On the 27th day of the bank's 30-day deadline, Ethan Caldwell walked back into Prairie State Bank at 1:58 in the afternoon with a cashier's check in the inside pocket of his jacket, and everything about the moment was ordinary except for what the check represented, because from the outside it looked like a man returning to settle a problem, and from the inside it was a man closing a chapter the bank had already written the ending for without knowing the full story, and the receptionist greeted him with the same familiarity she had shown the first time, and within a minute he was sitting across from Mark Halverson again, the same desk, the same file now updated with interest calculations and final notices, and Mark opened the folder with the professional composure of someone expecting either partial compliance or a difficult conversation, and said, "Ethan, we're at day 27, so I need to know where we stand on the equipment sale," and Ethan didn't answer that question directly, not because he was avoiding it, but because the question itself no longer applied, and instead he reached into his jacket, took out the cashier's check, and placed it on the desk face up, and Mark looked down at it, expecting a payment, expecting progress, expecting something within the range of what he understood, and then his expression changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, because the number printed on the check did not fit into any of those expectations. $520,000, and he picked it up, looked at it again, and then looked at Ethan as if confirming that what he was seeing aligned with reality, and said, "This is more than the outstanding balance," and Ethan said, "It is," and Mark said, "The total due with interest is $183,600, and Ethan nodded. "I'd like the loan settled in full and the remainder returned." And there was a pause then, not long, but long enough for the shift in understanding to settle into the room, and Mark asked the question that had not occurred to him at any point in the previous 4 weeks. "Where did this come from?" And Ethan answered in the same tone he had used throughout, calm, precise, without emphasis, "Subsurface rights on the west parcel." And Mark repeated the words as if translating them, "Subsurface rights," and Ethan said, "Retained in a 1992 transaction, documented in my records, leased this morning to a resource company." And Mark leaned back slightly in his chair, not dramatically, not visibly shaken, but with the measured adjustment of someone recalibrating their understanding in real time, and said, "We didn't have that information in your file." And Ethan said, "You didn't ask," and the statement was not delivered as criticism or accusation, but as a simple fact, and that made it land with more weight than either of those would have, because it exposed a gap without assigning blame. And Mark looked at the check again, then at the file, then back at Ethan, and for a moment there was nothing to say that would change what had already happened, and so he did what his position required. He processed the payment, entered the figures, generated the settlement documents, all with the same technical competence he had demonstrated from the beginning, because competence in execution does not depend on completeness of understanding, and within minutes the loan was cleared, the lien released, and a new check issued for the remaining balance, $336,400, and Mark handed it across the desk and said, "Your account is settled." And Ethan took it, nodded once, and stood, and there was a brief moment where it seemed like something more might be said, some acknowledgement, some reflection, but both men understood that the essential part of the conversation had already occurred, not in what was said, but in what had been revealed, and Ethan shook his hand and walked out of the office, through the lobby, and into the afternoon light that had not changed in any visible way but felt different because the weight he had carried into the building was no longer there, and when he got back to his truck, he sat for a moment before starting the engine, not out of exhaustion or relief, but out of recognition, because what had happened over the past 27 days was not a sudden reversal of fortune or an unexpected stroke of luck. It was the result of something that had existed all along, documented, preserved, and unnoticed until a situation forced him to look for it, and the tractor in his equipment shed was still there, unchanged, never listed for sale, never moved, and when he drove back to the farm and parked and walked into the shed, it was exactly where it had always been, and he stood there for a moment looking at it the same way he had on the day the bank told him to sell it. But the question that had occupied his mind then had been answered, not by choosing between keeping the tractor or losing it, but by understanding that the decision itself had been based on an incomplete picture, and now that the picture was complete, The outcome had taken care of itself, and Ethan turned off the shed lights and walked back to the house as the sun dropped lower over the western edge of his land. The same 60 acres that had appeared empty for most of his life, and that now represented something entirely different, not because it had changed, but because he had finally asked the question that revealed what it had always contained.